Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with our weekly lecture series. Today's lecture is on the Benoni, and it's sponsored by Eric Osgood, who doesn't think he's good at chess, but is always striving to get better. And I think that's everybody. So this is the Wikipedia article in the Benoni defense. They start talking about d4, c5, which is a very old version of the opening, which is very rare nowadays. Then they talk about the more modern version, which is what we're going to talk about today. They talk about the naming of it and when it was first played and so forth, different kinds of Benonis. Today, we're going to concentrate on the modern Benoni, and the positions that we see will be different variations of the modern Benoni, as well as games that were won by white and black, not just from one person's point of view or one color's point of view. And they talk about other Benonis and things that are less common. ECO codes aren't very important now, and so forth. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about move order. And we're going to be flipping the colors because some games are going to be from black's point of view and some from white's point of view. Let me flip the board. Okay, so these games are games that I knew before. And when somebody said, I'd like a Benoni lecture, I thought of some games. And I decided to pick 4 games because usually during a lecture I show 4 games. And these are 4 famous games in the Benoni. This is from the World Championship match between Fischer and Spassky in 1972. And typically, we don't think of the Benoni as something that's happening a lot in the World Championship matches. It's a very fighting, very aggressive, some would say unsound opening. I'm not one of those people. And the reason this game is very important is this is actually the first time that Fischer beat Spassky in a game. Before they played their match in 1972, Fischer had never beaten Spassky and had lost to him twice. And then the first game of the match, Fischer made the famous blunder. Bishop takes the rook pawn and lost. Game 2, Fischer forfeited, and people thought the match might just be over. Fischer might not play any more games because it's unheard of at that time to forfeit a game in the World Championship and keep playing. It's weird. But anyway, Fischer played, and this was the first game that he won, and it was with a Benoni. Okay, so Fischer has black, and this is one of the move orders of the Benoni. The standard move order is c5, d5, e6. Nowadays, more standard, I guess, maybe, is to play d6 and then play g6. And later, we're going to play e6 and we're going to transpose and take on d5. All of these move orders will lead to very similar positions. What we're going to look at today in the Benoni is black fianchettoing his bishop and playing c5 and playing e6 and taking on d5. In what move order that happens, I don't know yet. Now, e6 is a common move to start with the Benoni because a lot of people, and you're going to see why I'm saying this in the last game that we look at this lecture. A lot of people have a very specific line that they don't want to face, and some people don't care. And that line is c5, d5, e6, and we're going to look at a game that goes like this. And the very, very, very aggressive f4 and bishop b5 check. And some people do not want to play this with black. And so to avoid this line, a lot of people play e6, and they're only going to play the Benoni if white plays knight f3. If white plays knight f3, There's no f4 variation because the knight's on f3 blocking the f pawn. And if white plays knight c3, they're going to play the Nimzo-Indian. So there's some people like that. Okay, so this is Spassky Fischer, game 3 of their World Championship match. And knight f3 was played, so now Fischer played c5. Now, one thing I'd like to explain, which I do every lecture and every class I give and every private lesson and in my dreams and in the sky, when an opening is played, it is not played by one person. An opening is an amalgam of moves played by both sides that lead to those positions in the opening. So if white is playing rook g1, rook h1, rook g1, rook h1, that's not an opening. And black can't say, oh yeah, when they play rook g1, rook h1, I play the Sicilian. No, you don't play the Sicilian. You don't play anything. Openings are when both people do it. So in this position, and in any position in chess, you cannot force the opening you want to play against an opponent who isn't playing the opening. And openings that have names are because people played them before, grandmasters gave them names, and people thought the moves were good. So if you play good moves, and I play good moves, then typically that has a name. If one side plays ridiculous moves that nobody would ever play, typically that does not have a name. So if you play the Benoni with black, it's possible that your whole life you would never have a Benoni because your opponent wouldn't play the moves that would lead to it. It's unlikely, but it's possible. So in this position, to start the Benoni, white plays the move d5. White doesn't have to play d5. White can play knight c3, e3, g3, all very reasonable. But d5 is the most testing because we're gaining space and we're stopping black from playing knight c6. So if you're playing a stronger player and they want to get the advantage, they're going to play d5 because most of the best players in the world, and even just random grandmasters like me, they think white gets the advantage of the Benoni, but the Benoni is very tricky. Okay, so Fischer traded, and this is the modern Benoni. This is like the main line, and he played knight d2. More common is to play e4. And the idea of knight d2 is the c4 square is a very nice square for the knight, the white knight in the Benoni. Knight to c4, excellent square. Can't be attacked by a pawn because the knight's defending that. And then the knight is pressuring d6. And white can build a big center with e4 and f4, or white can build a solid center with e4 and f3 and have this nice pawn chain. So knight d2 is a very reasonable move. Knight d7, e4. And this is a very typical modern Benoni when you see this pawn structure. So if you see a fianchettoed bishop like this and pawns on d6 and c5, and white has pawns on e4 and d5, that's a Benoni. And typically it's called the modern Benoni. The modern Benoni, which is the most exciting of all Benonis, is very complicated, positionally interesting, and tactically interesting. So if you don't like draws, you want to win or lose, you hate draws, this is the opening for you. Not too many draws, because the games are crazy, and even when the engine proclaims somebody's winning, that doesn't mean very much, because it's too complicated. So if you like those kind of complex positions where you're playing on both sides of the board and the center, this is the opening for you. And obviously, Fischer is a very uncompromising player. He wants to win with black, unlike some grandmasters today who want to play 25 moves of preparation and agree to a draw. Fischer wanted to win with both colors. Okay, so he castled. Rook e8, typical move in the Benoni. The rook is on the half-open line instead of on f8. Queen c2, defending the pawn. And in this position, Black played knight h5, and that was a novelty at the time. And some say that's a move that changed chess history, because by winning this game, Fischer then started having good results and ended up winning the match and such. And knight h5 is a very double-edged move where Fischer says, I don't care about my pawn structure very much. I want active pieces, and I want the two bishops. And typically, before this game, people weren't afraid of knight h5 because they just assumed by taking this and ruining Black's pawn structure, that would be good for White. And Fischer said it's more complicated than that. There's piece activity, there's two bishops, there's attack. So the pawn structure is just one thing. Now, of course, White doesn't need to take this knight, but the idea is clear. Black wants to play knight f4. Black clears the way for the bishop, and the knight can go to e5, and Black has positional play on the dark squares. So Spassky did take the knight, because that's why White plays this way, trying to prove that Black can't ruin his pawn structure like this. Okay, a knight c4. That's why Spassky plays knight d2. He wants his knight on c4. Now he's threatening the d6 pawn. So knight e5, that defends the pawn by discovery. Knight e3. Notice the f5 square is very weak because Black's pawn isn't on g6 anymore. So White tries to take advantage of that. Then queen h4. So Fischer says, I'm going to play aggressively. I'm going to attack. And I don't care about the pawn structure so much. I just want to get an initiative. Bishop d2. Fischer threatens mate. Queen takes h2 mate. Knight takes. Fischer straightens out his pawn structure. And bishop f4, which stops Black from attacking. And the bishop is attacking the d6 pawn. Queen f6, defending the pawn, attacking the bishop. And they just develop their pieces. And Fischer says, I have the two bishops. Now, b6 is a very important positional move, and we're going to see this in some modern Benonis. Black, in this position, well, let's start with this position, wants to play b5 and b4 and gain space on the queen side. And White says, no, you're not going to do that. I'm playing a4. This is typical in Benonis. Black wants to play b5, and White says no. Now, Black still wants to play b5, so typically you would play a6 and then b5. But unfortunately for Black, because of the en passant rule, White can play a5, and if Black ever plays b5, I'll take it en passant. And then you don't get your b pawn going. So what Fischer does, Fischer plays b6, and he's going to play a6 and then b5. So if you play a5 now, I can just play b5. No more en passant. Okay, so rook e1, a6, b5. Black has two bishops and a big queenside expansion. And the reason Spassky put his rooks here is the rook and queen defend the pawn on b2, so that Black can't ever play queen takes b2. Queen g6. Black also wants to move his rooks to good positions. And White blocks it up with b4. And Black has a choice here. Black can play c4 and get the passed pawn, or Black can take and sort of ruin his pawn structure. So Fischer decided to get the passed pawn. And Spassky was hoping he would have a blockade so that Black couldn't win because it's all blocked up. And Fischer attacks, and the e4 pawn is tender. It's attacked several times, and one of its main defenders is the knight on c3, which I can get rid of. Bishop on f4 can never defend. So what Black's going to be a pawn up, and eventually he takes the pawn after moving around doing nothing. He says, okay, I'll take the pawn. And Spassky is hoping with bishops opposite colors, that would help him get to a drawn position. But with queens on the board and black having a passed pawn on c4, it's not to be. Okay, now our pawn is attacked on d5. So he threatens checkmate with queen to g7, queen g6, queen b1, pinning the bishop, and black is easily winning. Bishop d3 check, and this was the first game Fischer won against Spassky. Spassky resigned. If you play king d2, you get checkmated. And if you play king e1, I take this with check, and I'm up 2 connected passed pawns with an attack. And if you play king e3, I play queen d1, threatening your bishop, and threatening queen f3 checkmate if bishop d2. So there's not really not a good move here. If you play bishop b2, I have this nice checkmate, and then queen c2 mate, whether you play king c1 or king c3. Same checkmate, queen c2. So after bishop d3 check, Spassky resigned. Fischer won the game. He played a Benoni. He got a very complicated position. He played the interesting knight h5 idea. He outplayed Spassky, and he won the game. And the game was very complex, and black got chances, and that's what black is hoping for in a Benoni, is to get unclear position, and the better player will win. Of course, if you have black in a Benoni, and that's what you play, and you're playing somebody, well, them having white in a Benoni, that's just one opening they have white in, because black can play an array of different defenses against d4. So if you play the Benoni every game with black, and your opponent with white faces the Benoni sometimes, and sometimes faces a Bogo Indian, or a Queen's Gambit declined, or a Queen's Gambit accepted, or a Slav, or a semi-Slav, or a King's Indian, then you're going to have more experience. So a lot of the times at the club level, when the game is a Benoni, black knows more opening theory than white does, because that's what black plays, and white, that's just one of the things they face. At the super GM level, they know everything. So you don't really get an advantage having black in a Benoni at the super GM level, because when super GMs have white, they somehow memorize all theory. It's like they study chess all the time. Okay. And again, I don't want to just show games that white won or games that black won. I want to give you, examples of when things work and don't work. This is a famous game because Mikhail was the world chess champion and one of the greatest players of all time. And he played one of the best British players, Jonathan Penrose. And Tal was a specialist in playing black in the Benoni and sacrificing and crushing his opponents. This was played in the Olympiad, Soviet Union, which won every Olympiad, because the team was basically filled with world champions. World champion on every board. And they played, England, which, is after Jonathan Penrose, I don't know who the other players are. Okay, and this is a famous game because not only did Penrose beat Tal, which is a big upset, he did it with a very unusual idea, which is very common today because of this game. This game introduced a good positional idea that we still use. Okay, so Tal played the Benoni, played an unusual move order, but you get the same position. Okay, and in this position, white can play f4, h3, knight f3, bishop d3, knight e2, and bishop g5. White's played every move. Okay, so he played bishop d3 and knight e2. That's one way to play against the Benoni. Okay, and with the knight on e2, black cannot successfully pin the knight, which probably would do if the knight was on f3. And because if you play bishop g4, I can just play f3. And if white has his druthers, he might play f4 at some point. Okay, so a6, because black wants to play b5 in the Benoni. So very often in the early stages of the Benoni, black is playing a6 and white's playing a4, with the idea of black wants to play b5 and white doesn't want black to play b5. So that's what happened here. And if you play over 1,000 games of the Benoni, you'll see a6 and a4 in like 700 of them, because those are just common moves in the opening. Okay, black played queen c7, which is unusual. Tal seems like he wants to play c4 and attack the bishop. h3, which prevents the knight and the bishop from going to g4. And another idea is white wants to play bishop f4 sometimes, and after knight h5 attacking the bishop can tuck away at h2. So h3 has some good ideas. Knight bd7, and he plays f4, very aggressive, rook e8, knight g3. One of the advantages of playing knight e2 is you can play knight g3 and defend your pawn on e4. And unlike a lot of Benonis, where black is trying to attack on the king's side, white is attacking on the king's side by pushing all his kingside pawns. So that's very exciting. c4, attacking the bishop. The bishop retreats and maintains a defense of the e4 pawn. Knight c5. Black is very active. Black's knight has some squares. e4 pawn is under tremendous pressure, etc. Queen f3, defending the e pawn again and preparing to push pawns on the king's side. Knight f d7, which gets out of the way of the bishop. These are typical Benoni ideas. Okay, now this is a very important thing that happens right now, and sort of changes the evaluation of these positions. Typically, if white advances on the king's side and plays f5, then we play knight e5, and the bishop on c2 is not very good, blocked by these pawns, and black has these excellent knights on e5 and c5, and black has excellent counterplay. So it's hard to play f5 because you're giving away the e5 square to black. It's hard to play e5 because e5 is defended 1,000,000 times. There's a pawn here, and a knight here, and a rook here, a bishop here, queen here. So it looks like white can't go forward. Okay, and Penrose played bishop e3, developing his last minor piece. Tal played b5, getting counterplay on the queen side. Penrose said, thanks for the free pawn. And then rook b8. And Tal said, you know, you moved your bishop here, so if this pawn takes, I can play rook takes b2, and I'm attacking everything. I'm crashing through on the queen side. And this was the great idea by Penrose. Queen f2, that's a good move because we're putting pressure on the diagonal, and our queen is defending the queen side over here. AB and e5. And the point of e5 is the queen and bishop are putting pressure on the c5 knight, so it's not easy for black to just start taking on e5. We have to keep an eye on c5. And e5 is an idea that I have used in similar positions and many other people have, and because of this, players with black are expecting e5 in this kind of position. And I'm going to explain what's going on here. What's going on here is if I play f5, you play knight e5, and black's pieces are excellent. So what we're doing is we're sacrificing a pawn to take away the e5 square from black. So black wants to play knight e5 as soon as white plays f5. So white makes knight e5 illegal. He plays e5, and after takes, he plays f5. And this was sort of revolutionary when this was played in 1960. Now it's standard stuff because we know this game. And now this pawn is blocking all of black's pieces. Black's pieces can't jump over the pawn, and now white has serious threat of taking on g6 and playing queen f7 check, which would win the game immediately. White's attacking on the f file. And when black does something about that, white can put a knight on e4, blocking this e5 pawn forever, which stifles all of these black pieces. black would be so happy if this pawn just disappeared off the board. Then all of black's pieces come to life. But that pawn actually is bad for black because it blocks all of his pieces. Okay, first things first, we can't allow FG and queen f7 check. So he played bishop b7, which defends his rook. So now if queen f7 check, you can't play queen takes rook because it's defended. Okay, rook a d1, defending his pawn on d5. Bishop a8, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and knight e4. And positionally, black is lost. And that's because his pawn is on e5. If I could magically take the pawn away, I think black would be fine. But now black can't move any pieces anywhere, and white has a crushing attack. Notice all of white's pieces are aimed towards the king side, and a majority of black's pieces are on the queen side. So that's not good for black's king. And white has a passed d5 pawn also. And all of white's pieces are participating. Knight a4, attacking the b pawn, but that's too little too late. Gets rid of that. Takes on g6. Queen f7 check. Knight c5, another brilliant move. So obviously you can't play knight takes knight because of queen takes queen. Or you could mouse slip and lose your queen like me. Yeah, that would be an overwrite, yeah. And you can't take with the queen because I'll play bishop takes queen. And white is threatening both knight takes d7, queen takes d7, and probably the most important point, knight e6. Forking the queen and queen g7 mate. White has a lot of threats. He played queen a7. That way if the knight moves, he can play queen takes e3 check. Queen takes, and white's up a piece. And Penrose was good enough to win a piece up for basically nothing. And Tall played on just because, it's a team match, so he can't really resign. But he doesn't have any compensation for a piece. And after g3, he resigned because now you're going to lose a lot more material. Bishop has to defend the rook, but you can't. So all the squares are protected. So Tall got really crushed that game by basically an unknown player in an Olympiad where the Soviet Union always won the Olympiad in Tall's favorite opening. And that became the birth of the idea e5, f5, knight e4, and white just crashes through and prevents black from using the e5 square for their knight. Now, of course, it doesn't always work, and the next game is a very excellent example of black taking advantage of having access to the e5 square, and even with the threat of losing a piece, black does not give up the option to go to e5. Now, this is one of the most famous games ever played. And luckily, I was a chess player when the game was played. I was about 2,000 rated. And this was this was the most famous game in many years because of the political turmoil. 1976, Korchnoi defected from the Soviet Union to the West, and since then played for Switzerland. And the Soviets boycotted Korchnoi, so if there was an international tournament, Soviets wouldn't play. Or the Soviets would go to a tournament and tell the organizers, Korchnoi can't play, and if you let Korchnoi play, we're not showing up. So there was a boycott. No Soviets would play Korchnoi. And this was in an Olympiad where there's nothing you can do. Switzerland plays the Soviet Union, then somebody's going to play Korchnoi. Korchnoi's board won for Switzerland. And so this was 1982. Korchnoi was always playing for the World Championship. He played in 1974, lost to Karpov. Karpov won on forfeit against Fischer. Karpov became world champion. He played Karpov in 1978. Karpov won that match. He played Karpov in 1981. Karpov won that match. So Korchnoi's lost these matches for the World Championship in 74, 77, 78, and 81. And this is 1982. Korchnoi's near the end of his World Championship run. He's getting older. And the new face in town is Garry Kasparov. And so anytime Korchnoi, Karpov, or Kasparov would get paired, that was big news. And this was the biggest news because this is the first time they ever played in a tournament. It turned out before Korchnoi defected, he played Kasparov in a simul when Kasparov was a small child. And Korchnoi was still Soviet. And Kasparov won that game as a little kid in the simul. But this is the first game as adults, and it's one of the few games a Soviet player played Korchnoi. It's very rare, because Korchnoi is a defector, persona non grata. And this is one of the greatest chess games ever played. And there's a very famous story about this game. The Soviets had a big team. They had all their super grandmaster, world champion players on their Olympic team, plus they had a big entourage. Some of the entourage were KGB. And for the KGB and for the entourage, this is a very important game. You got to beat Korchnoi. And they looked at the position, and the guy walks in who's like the top KGB agent. He just shows up to the tournament. He looks at the position and he says, Kasparov's pieces are all hanging, and I don't know what move he can make to save the game. And his comrade said, it's not his turn. So the game was so complicated, nobody could understand it except the players. They didn't understand it either. But that's the Benoni for you. Okay, so we're very lucky that two big fighting players played the Benoni. They transposed because Kasparov played c5 later, d5, and you get to this modern Benoni where white's fianchettoed his king bishop. Okay, and we have the Benoni pawn structure, g6, bishop g7, d6, c5, and Korchnoi's played the fianchetto variation. a6, as I said earlier, black plays a6 a lot in the Benoni, and white plays a4. Okay. Rook e8, knight d2, we saw Spassky do that against Fischer. Knight bd7, h3, stopping knight g4. Rook b8, black wants to play b5. Knight c4, white wants to play knight takes d6. Knight e5, the queen defends d6. And now knight a3, saying, ha, you can't play b5. Knight h5, black wants to play f5 and get some attack on the king's side. Opens up the diagonal for his bishop. e4, and black plays rook f8. Very paradoxical move. Black wants to play f5, so he puts his rook back on f8. King h2, which is fine. f5, f4. And the rest of the game is very difficult to comprehend. Unless you're an engine, then it's not too bad. But this was 1982. They didn't have engines. So we had to do our own analysis. And the very famous analysis, I won't name the grandmaster because there's no reason to. A grandmaster, an American grandmaster, annotated this game for Chess Life. And his annotations were so bad, he wrote a letter of apology in the next issue saying, sorry, my annotations are really bad. He basically saw that black won, so he was giving black's moves exclamation marks and white's moves question marks. That's not the story of the game. The story of the game is it's the most complicated game ever. Okay, so typically when somebody plays f4, you move your knight away because your knight's hanging. Kasparov played b5, sacrificing on the other side of the board. And the idea is black has tremendous compensation by taking this, attacking g3, and also threatening b4, which forks the knights. So Korchnoi took the pawn and took again. Korchnoi is a pawn up, and he's threatening the knight on e5. And Kasparov ignores that and just takes on e4. He says, if you want my knight, I'm going to sacrifice. And Korchnoi correctly just takes back. Bishop d7, putting pressure on the b5 knight. Queen e2, defending the knight. Queen b6, attacking the knight again. Knight a3. Notice the knight on e5 is never moving. Rook e8. Bishop d2 is actually a good move. Queen takes b2. And in this position, white made the losing move. But actually, later, white wasn't losing because Kasparov messed up. And what's funny is that the losing move is to finally take the knight. And in this position, engines today say white has a fine position if he plays the move knight c2. And the idea is the black queen is trapped, so, white's threatening like rook b1. Of course, this position, you could argue the queen is already trapped, but we have tactics. When I say we have tactics, I ain't kidding either. If you play rook b1 in this position, I'd play knight f3 check, confusing the audience. If you take with the bishop, you lose your queen with check. If you take with the queen, I take this with check, and I'm attacking your knight, and it's pinned, and the queen's not trapped anymore. And if you move your king, I can take this bishop. My knight's defending it. So you can't, queen takes b2 is a dangerous looking move, but rook b1 doesn't work. The other rook to b1 doesn't work because the knight's hanging. So the queen on b2 is actually okay. Okay, Korchnoi made the losing move. He took on e5. Bishop takes e5. Black is down a piece, but black has a plethora of threats. g3 pawn, the c3 knight, pin going on here. So knight c4, attacking the queen and the bishop, and white's up a piece, and so forth. And Kasparov ignores all of that. And, I have these personal stories about watching Kasparov analyze, not this particular game, but other games in the 80s and 90s when I lived in Europe. And it was like you were dreaming, like how much he saw, how much tactics he could see. It wasn't like any other human I've ever watched analyze chess. It was different. And I can't even explain it to you. You had to be there to see it. Unbelievable. And Kasparov, didn't care about his queen. He played knight takes g3. He's got his own threats. And you can see how complicated the position is. Almost all of the pieces on the board are attacked. The rook is attacked, the queen is attacked, the bishop's attacked, these pieces are attacked. And conversely, this can capture this, the knight can capture the queen, the knight can capture the bishop, and it's white's move. Okay. He played rook f8 check, which is fine. Rook f8, queen e1, and now Kasparov's queen is attacked, his bishop's attacked, and black is down a piece. So it looks good for Korchnoi. Knight takes e4 check, discovered check. And in this position, you can't take the queen because you're in check. So he played king g2. If you play knight takes e5, then I can play knight takes d2, and I'm threatening queen takes knight and knight f3 double check, winning the queen. And I think knight f1 double check leads to checkmate. I think queen h2 is mate next move. Okay, so he played king g2. In this position, Kasparov made a mistake, which should have cost him the win. And he played the move, oh no, queen c2 is okay. Knight takes e5, and this is where he made a mistake. In this position, he played rook f2 check. That actually throws away the win. And they were in time trouble. In this position, knight takes d2 is the winning move, threatening knight f3 check. and threatening queen takes knight. And there's some variation where it's something like rook c1, defending the knight, knight f3 check, rook takes, knight takes check is winning for black, because black's threatening all of white's pieces. Okay, but Kasparov blundered, played rook f2 check, and now the game should be a draw. It should be a draw. Queen takes is forced, takes, rook a2, excellent move, and black's losing all of his pieces. Black's bishop is attacked, black's knight is attacked, and black's king doesn't have a lot of defense. So now the engine actually says it's a draw. Queen f5, knight takes d7, knight d3, and in this position, he played bishop h6, which loses. And Korchnoi actually lost this game on time. But when he lost on time, he was losing anyway. He would have lost on the board. And in this position, white has an amazing draw, which doesn't make a lot of sense, which is rook check. You can't play king f7 because rook f8 check wins your queen. So you have to play king g7. And then you simply play rook a7. And the king can't escape. The king can't get out. And if you take this bishop, queen check, and queen takes bishop, I play knight e5 check. I think it's knight e5 check. Yes. And the king can't go to f6 because knight e4 check wins the queen. And if the king goes to h6, we check. You can't play king g5 because knight e4 check wins the queen, but I forced you to play king g5. So white's winning. So in this position, the engine says we repeat. Always repeat. And if you try to win by moving your king here, it doesn't work for some reason. I think in this position, we play knight b5 check. You can't play king b6 because knight c4 check wins your queen. And if you play this, you get checkmated. And now rook c7 is mate and knight d6 is mate. Anyway, the engines all figured this out. Actually, grandmasters figured it out first, that this was a draw. So I think if Korchnoi had time on his clock, he probably would have played rook a8, rook a7 and drawn the game. But he played bishop h6, and after queen takes knight, he's just completely lost. Check, rook h8, king f6. And here, white lost on time, but white's losing his bishop on h6 and has no pieces left. So that was an amazing game, and they analyzed that game for years, like trying to see who went wrong and where. And basically, all of Kasparov's sacrifices were correct in the opening and middle game. And the losing move was taking the knight on e5. Kasparov gave back the half point, and then in horrible time trouble, Korchnoi blundered and lost. But it was an amazing game, and that's what you get with the Benoni. Games that don't make a lot of sense are just a lot of tactics. And you have to be great at calculating, which both players were. So it was a really good time for that game. Both players at the top of their game. Korchnoi just a year earlier losing a world championship match. Kasparov becoming the world champion contender and then world champion that he became a few years after this game. Okay, last but not least, I just showed you a game Kasparov won with black. Now I'm going to show you a miniature that he won with white. And a lot of people thought this game refuted this opening. They said, after this, black can't play this way anymore. But they found different ways to play since. This is against John Nunn. John Nunn, very famous person in his own right, not just in chess. I recommend you go to Wikipedia and look up John Nunn, N-U-N-N, and you'll see he's a very accomplished person in chess and in other things. This was played in an Olympiad, Soviet Union versus England, and was a Benoni. And Kasparov played for the kill. He played e4 and f4, the super aggressive line, which I talked about earlier in the lecture, and bishop b5 check. Knight fd7 is the most common move. a4 before black plays a6 and b5. So Nunn plays knight a6 because the knight has good squares on c7 and b4. Knight f3. Knight goes to b4 where it can't be evicted. Castles a6. And he takes on d7 because Kasparov decided, hey, you moved your knight over here and you didn't castle and you moved your knight over here. I'm going to checkmate you. You're not developing your pieces and castling. You just keep moving your knights all over the board. So instead of retreating the bishop and giving black a tempo to castle and get the king safe, he just goes on the attack. Takes the knight and plays f5. He says, you know what? This grandmaster, his name is Finegold. He kept saying you can't play f5 in the Benoni because of knight e5. Well, there's no more knight. There's no knight coming to e5. So now I can play f5 and just start an attack. Castles, bishop g5, and here black has a tough choice. f6 really kills this bishop on g7, and other moves also don't work out very well. He did play f6. Now the d-pawn's attacked, and he took on f5, but he's going to get attacked on the king side with his pawns move forward, and the knight on b4 has no defense. So I can play queen d2 and make a battery, g4, h4, and white just has a big attack, and black doesn't have any counterplay because black can't play knight e5, and black blocked his bishop. So Nunn took on f5 because that gives black counterplay, opens up the position for his bishops. Bishop takes d6, threatening his rook. Bishop takes a4, discovered attack on the bishop, attacking the queen. And this is just what black is looking for in a Benoni, these really sharp tactics. Unfortunately, white is Garry Kasparov, so if you try to play tactically against him, it's not going to work out very well. Rook takes, queen takes. And now the move that Nunn probably underestimated, knight h4. Like, to me, it's obvious now because, once white plays knight f5, game's virtually over. And there's nothing that black can do about that. Knight f5 is coming, and then white's pieces just go over to the king side, and black has no defense. Takes, knight f5, knight takes e4, black's king is suffering, knight takes c5 is a threat. You can't play queen takes d5 because knight e7 check wins your queen. You can't play knight takes d5 because I just take it with check, and then I fork, and I'm up a piece. So you can't take on d5. So he played king h8. Now he can take on d5 because knight e7 is not check anymore, although it's not his move. So knight takes c5, attacking the queen. And you can't take on d5 here because I think several moves win. I want to say queen g4 is the move. No, queen g4 is not the move. So in this position, he actually resigned because the knight is attacked and the queen is attacked, and I'm also going to play knight e6. So this move seems forced, and I know white has an immediate win here. I guess you just take the queen and play knight e6. That seems like a very timid way to win. I wanted to win with flair, but I don't see a way to do it. So I can win, I guess, just by doing this and attacking your rook and your bishop. So you're going to lose material here. It's not something I would resign, but okay, Nunn had enough. So after knight c5, the game ended very quickly. Black resigned, and people stopped playing this variation for black because of the ease which with Kasparov won with white. And a lot of times in the Benoni, the games end sort of quickly because somebody makes a mistake, they miss a tactic, and then one side is just overwhelmingly winning. But you can see Kasparov won with white and black in the Benoni, very complicated tactical games, which is right up his alley. Anyway, if you like those kinds of tactical, complicated games where you're playing on both sides of the board and anybody can lose at any moment. That's your kind of opening, the Benoni. Very complicated, very sharp, very interesting, and you need to do a lot of study to learn the different lines, and even then, you can still lose quickly like Nunn did. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. Thanks for watching the Benoni lecture. Once again, I want to thank Eric Osgood for sponsoring the lecture. If you want to sponsor a lecture, contact my wife Karen. Her email is karen@aclchessclub.com, and I'll see you guys next time with more lectures. Bye, everybody.